In the universities, the most surprising and reprehensible development came some 20 years ago, around 1968, and has had a very long-range effect, one that is still percolating. Suddenly, all sorts of people, faculty members at the universities, graduate and undergraduate students, they all began to blame the universities, not just for their own palpable ills, but for all the ills of history and society. Schools were blamed, and to some extent still are, by the budding school of resentment and its precursors, as though they were not only representative of these ills, but, weirdly enough, as though they had somehow helped cause these ills, and, even more surrealistically, as though they were somehow capable of ameliorating these ills. It's still going on, this attempt to ascribe both culpability and apocalyptic potential to the universities. It's really asking the universities to take the place that was once occupied by religion, philosophy, and science, which were our conceptual modes. They have failed us. The entire history of Western culture, from Alexandrian days until now, shows that when a society's conceptual modes fail it, then willy-nilly it becomes a literary culture. This is probably neither good nor bad, but just the way things become. And we can't really ask literature or the representatives of a literary culture, in or out of the university, to save society. Literature is not an instrument of social change or an instrument of social reform. It is more a mode of human sensations and impressions, which do not reduce very well to societal rules or forms. One reaction to the school of resentment is to declare oneself an aesthete, which, of course, I do now, in furious reaction to their school and to so much other pernicious nonsense that goes on. I would certainly see myself as an aesthete, in the sense advocated by Ruskin, indeed to a considerable degree by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and certainly by the divine Walter Pater and the sublime Oscar Wilde. Literary criticism in the United States increasingly is split between very low-level literary journalism and what I increasingly regard as a disaster, which is literary criticism in the academies, particularly in the younger generations. Increasingly, scores and scores of graduate students have read the absurd Lacan, but have never read Edmund Spencer, or have read a great deal of Foucault or Derrida, but scarcely read Shakespeare or Milton. That's obviously an absurd defeat for literary study. When I was a young man back in the 50s, starting out on what was to be my career, I used to proclaim that my chosen profession seemed to consist of a secular clergy or clerisy. I was thinking, of course, of the highly Anglo-Catholic New Criticism under the sponsorship or demigodness of T.S. Eliot. But I realized, in latish middle age, that, no better or worse, I was surrounded by a pride of displaced social workers, a rabblement of lemmings, all rushing down to the sea, carrying their subject down to destruction with them. The school of resentment is an extraordinary sort of melange of latest model feminists, Lacanians, that whole semiotic cackle, latest model pseudo-Marxists, so-called new historicists who are neither new nor historicist, and third-generation deconstructors, who I believe have no relationship whatever to literary values. It's really a very paltry kind of a phenomenon, but it is pervasive, and it seems to be waxing rather than waning. It is a very rare thing indeed to encounter one critic, academic or otherwise, not just in the English-speaking world, but also in France or Italy, who has an authentic commitment to aesthetic values, who reads for the pleasure of reading, and who values poetry or story as such. Above all else, reading has become a very curious kind of activity. It has become tendentious in the extreme. A sheer deliquescence has taken place because of this obsession with the methods or supposed method. No, criticism starts. It has to start with a real passion for reading. It can come in adolescence, even in your 20s, but you must fall in love with what we used to call imaginative literature. And when you are in love that way, with or without provocation from good teachers, you will pass on to encounter what used to be called the sublime. And as soon as you do this, you pass into the agonistic mode, even if your nature is anything but agonistic. In the end, the spirit that makes one a fan of a particular athlete or sports team is different only in degree, not in kind, from the spirit that teaches one to prefer one poet to another, or one novelist to another. That is to say, there is some element of competition at every point in one's experience as a reader. How could there not be? Perhaps you learn this as you get older, but in the end, you choose between books, or you choose between poems, the way you choose between people. You can't become friends with every acquaintance you make, and I would not think that it is any different with what you read. I do not believe in myths of decline or myths of progress, even as regards to the literary scene. The world does not get to be a better or a worse place, it just gets more senescent. The world gets older, without getting either better or worse, and so does literature. But I do think that the drab current phenomenon that passes for literary studies in the university will finally provide its own corrective. That is to say, sooner or later, students and teachers are going to get terribly bored with all the technocratic social work going on now. There will be a return to aesthetic ideals and desires, or these people will simply find something else to do with their time. But I do find a great deal of hypocrisy in what they're doing now. It is tiresome to be encountering myths called the social responsibility of the critic, or the political responsibility of the critic. I would rather walk into a bookstore and find a book called The Aesthetic Responsibilities of the Statesman, or The Literary Responsibilities of the Engineer. Criticism is not a program for social betterment, not an engine for social change. I don't see how it possibly could be. If you look for the best instance of a socially radical critic, you find a very good one indeed in William Hazlitt, but you will not find that his social activism on the left in any way conditions his aesthetic judgments, or that he tries to make imaginative literature a machine for revolution. You would not find much difference in aesthetic response between Hazlitt and Dr. Samuel Johnson on Milton, though Dr. Johnson is very much on the right politically, and Hazlitt, of course, very much an enthusiast for the French Revolution and for English radicalism. But I can't find much in the way of a Haslittian or Johnsonian temperament in life and literature anywhere on the current scene. There are so many tiresomenesses going on. Everyone is so desperately afraid of being called a racist or a sexist that they connive, whether actively or passively, the almost total breakdown of standards that has taken place both in and out of universities, where writings by blacks or Hispanics, or in many cases, simply women, are concerned. One could argue that this social movement has helped focus attention on some great novels, for example, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, but his is a very rare exception. What else is there like it? Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God has a kind of superior intensity and firm control. It's a very fine book indeed. It surprised and delighted me when I first read it, and it has sustained several rereadings. But that and The Invisible Man are the only full-scale works of fiction I have read by American blacks in this century that have survival possibilities at all. Alice Walker is an extremely inadequate writer, and I think that is giving her the best of it. A book like The Color Purple is of no aesthetic interest or value whatsoever, yet it is exalted and taught in the academies. It is clearly a time in which social and cultural guilt has taken over. I say this with fondness for feminist critics as people, some of whom are my close friends, but it is widely known I'm not terribly fond of feminist criticism. The true test is to find work, whether in the past or the present, by women writers that we had undervalued, and thus bring it to our attention and teach us to study it more closely or more usefully. By that test, feminist criticism has failed because it has not added one woman to the canon. The women writers who mattered, Jane Austen, George Eliot, Emily Dickinson, Edith Wharton, Willa Cather, and others who have always mattered on aesthetic grounds, still matter. I do not appreciate Elizabeth Bishop or Mae Swenson any more or less than I would have appreciated them if we had no feminist literary criticism at all. And I stare at what is presented to me as feminist literary criticism, and I shake my head. I regard it at best as being well-intentioned. It is not literary criticism. If people wish to practice a form of social or political literary criticism, that is their business. It is not mine. If it does not help me to read a work of aesthetic value, then I'm not going to be interested in it at all. I do not for a moment yield to the notion that any social, racial, ethnic, or male interest could determine my aesthetic choices. I have a lifetime of experience, learning, and insight that tells me how to choose what to read.
Like, subscribe, notification bell, join the herd.